All right, guys, welcome to day 4 Q&A. So I'm back, Megan Peters, hailing from California here. You all should know who I am by now. And I've got hopefully three panelists with me today to talk about the tutorial and also to talk about GLMs in general and how you can use them for exciting neuroscience. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. So let's start with Jakob. Would you introduce yourself, please, as the celebrity of today?
Okay, so my name is Jakob Macke. I'm a professor for machine learning and science in Tübingen. And in my research, we developed machine learning methods for neural data analysis, which is the topic of today's part of Neuromatch Academy. It's been a great fun and privilege to help organize the day today. I was kind of the day lead for the day that tried to organize things behind the scenes, but primarily that work required me just to find some very good speakers and content makers that did all the hard work on this. So I've been helping a bit, but I've not. The credit for the tutorial should really go to the people that you've seen in the videos. And in the past, I've also helped organize or directed a physical summer school on computational neuroscience. So this has been an adventure to see how many of the good bits of summer schools have been transformed to an online format, but maybe made available to many, many more people than would ever be able to attend one of those small summer courses that we used to have in the past. So I hope you had fun in the machine learning day. And I'm sure there was a lot of material in it. And I just want to also assure you that the way these summer schools work is that you will see a lot of stuff. And the idea of that is for you to get excited and know what's there. But the idea is not that you have to understand everything right away, or that you have to feel like you have to get to the end of everything. If you try to do that, then there's a good chance you might be frustrated. So just take it as seeing what's there and try to understand as much as you can, but don't feel under pressure that everything has to work right away. All right.
Awesome, thank you. And Sean, will you give us a brief introduction? We should all hopefully know who you are as well, too, from some of the launch parties, but please.
Thanks, Megan. So I'm Sean Escola. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia University at in the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. I'm also one of the co-founders and board members of Neuromatch, along with Megan and some other folks who you've probably met and will meet. And so I'm really excited. This is actually my first official event in Neuromatch that I'm getting to participate in. I was just telling Jakob and Megan that in my early days as a graduate student, I got to play with some GLM models, looking at some neural data. And I just thought it was so cool that you could model, spikes with if you had the right probability distribution that you were working with, and that you could do inference and learning, and so that's always kind of been something that's continued to make me excited even years later.
Great, thanks. Okay, so before we get into all of the questions, and they're pouring in, so that's great, I'm going to do two things. The first is that I'm going to put up a poll, because starting today is where it gets really kind of intense. Yesterday was also starting to get pretty mathy and pretty intense, but we want to encourage people to actually go do yoga as well. So if you click on the polls down below, I want to see if you guys are doing this. You're moving, you're kind of getting out of your chair, because I sit in this chair a lot too. Get out of your chair and move, and go do something fun like that. And so you should see that. Yeah, cool. Maybe tomorrow. Come on, guys, go do yoga, or do it not with us. That's also fine if you don't want to be in front of a screen as well. But I also want to remind you guys to please go do your reflections as well. This is really important, and so I'm going to put the call to action. There's now a button on the bottom of your screen that says interactive student reflections. If you're an observer, also please type this URL into your browser as well. But especially for the interactive students, we really would like to have you do these. And we're actually going to give you just a couple minutes where we're not going to say anything, and we're going to encourage you, please go do these. And then we'll come back here and we'll talk about GLMs. And so we can just kind of hang out here and chat for a little bit, maybe in the chat. But please go do your reflections. So I have to be quiet now, just for a couple minutes.
You know, Megan, we're at 17-0. I feel like that's not putting in a big turnout for yoga. But,
I know. Well, so maybe you guys do something other than yoga. Maybe we can say if you do something other than yoga, or other. Oh, someone did yoga! Yay! That's great. Right. Wonderful. But if you're not doing the yoga sessions and you're not, doing some of the other virtual kind of fun activities that we're doing here, please also get out of your chair and go do something else that's fun, that is moving around and getting you out into nature or into the air or something like that. Okay. So we'll give you guys just a couple more minutes here before we launch into the big questions here.
So you just hit that link at the bottom to get to the reflections page.
Yeah, to get to the interactive student reflections survey, that should work if I typed it right. That makes it easy for our interactive students. They don't even have to, go into the chat and scroll up to be able to find it towards the beginning. You can just kind of go and do it. And so we can prompt people to do that kind of throughout as well for those folks who are just rolling in now.
And we have some, we probably have some observing students here today. Now, are they doing the reflections as well?
Yeah, they are. They're doing the reflections too, because some of them are following along almost at the same pace or at the same pace as the interactive students. And so we want to hear how that's working too for you guys, your observer students, if you're here, because we want to be able to understand what the difference is between doing this kind of on your own or in a self-organized way and with going through it with a TA and in a pod and doing group projects and everything. So yeah, please do that. Please do these. Okay. And okay, so I think that this is probably good for now. We can turn this off, but remember, please hit that button at the bottom of your screen if you are wanting to do this as we go through. So cool, great. So we can actually start to do the questions now. But again, I want to emphasize what Jakob said earlier, which is this is really not meant to be a PhD in a box in 3 weeks. There's a reason it takes 5 years to get a PhD or 6 years to get a PhD, and then you go do a postdoc. And so this is really just meant to be let's have fun and explore. And so we can talk about some of that stuff today too, if you guys have questions about how to kind of engage with the material in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. So definitely put those in the box if you want to talk about that stuff too. Okay, so we've got some questions already. This is great. So we've got a question about the tutorials. We can see if we can do this one. We don't have the people who actually built the actual tutorial here. What do you think, Jakob? Would you be able to answer the first one?
So you mean the highest voted one?
Yeah. So in the neuron spiking model, I can read it out or you can read it, but I'll read it out for the stream. So in the neuron spiking model, and this question comes from Yi Yan. So in the neuron spiking model example in tutorial 1, was making the firing rate lambda greater than 0 the only reason why we chose an exponential function for the nonlinearity section? Do we have to consider the pattern of our noise, for example, Poisson in this case, as well when making the nonlinearity decision? I guess my question in general is how to select a proper combination of the nonlinearity part and the noise distribution. So I think this is a pretty good question that maybe we can try to answer here.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question because it reflects on some of the difficulties that we have when building these models. And there's typically 2 types of considerations that go into building a model and choosing things such as the nonlinearity. And the first one is often computational. So we have to think about what model choices lead to a model that we can fit and handle with that have or that have good computational properties for fitting such a model. And in particular, as you saw in the tutorial, one desirable property of such a model fit is that it leads to an optimization function that's numerically easily solvable. And that's often problems that are convex. So where the fitting problem is convex, as you saw in the tutorials. And for some choices of these link functions, we will get a convex problem, in particular for the exponential function. For other choices, we will not get a convex function. So there's a computational reason for picking the exponential function. In fact, for this Poisson GLM, the exponential function is what's called the canonical choice. So it's the one nonlinearity that leads to a particularly kind of nice form of the formulas. And without going into the mathematical details too much, when we do log probabilities, you often get a lot of logs. And when you choose an exponential function, then the log and the exponential cancel, and all you get back is a very simple formula. So if you use any other nonlinearity, you get a more complex looking formula. And there's only a few nonlinearities that you can take to get a convex fitting function, in particular that exponential function and a soft threshold function, a soft linear function, and there's 2 or 3 other functions that you can choose if you want to have a convex fitting function. So there's some statistical or computational advantages to using the exponential function. But the question that you're asking is also whether, from a neuroscience perspective, whether there's good modeling reasons to pick an exponential function. So do we think that an exponential function is a better model of the underlying biology than a linear function? And one property that the exponential function has is that if you go to higher firing regimes, the exponential function gets steeper, so you're more sensitive to the noise. So the exponential function has this property that in a high firing rate regime, you are more variable, you have more, and you're more sensitive to the inputs. And depending on the system that you're studying, that might be an appropriate assumption. And for some quarter neurons it is. And in other cases, that might be undesirable. And you might get to a regime where you're too sensitive to your inputs. So to sum up, computationally, the exponential function is very easy and a good choice. And whether it's a good modeling assumption for the problem that you're studying really will depend on the problem that you're studying.
Great, thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's, I'll just add really quickly. I think it's really interesting to think about this problem between computational practicality and the underlying meaning in terms of the neuroscience. And those 2 things often are in conflict. Often they go in parallel, and that's of course the ideal situation. But when they're in conflict, then you have to make some choices. And so, one of the things that I would just want to add a little bit, and you were touching on this, is that although the exponential function is the one that's the canonical one that gives us the easiest form of the equations once you pass it through. There are other choices that still guarantee convexity in your optimization. And so some of those might not be the exact perfect link function and give you the simplest equations, but at least you still have a convex optimization at the end of the day, and maybe there are better choices for the neuroscience. And so that's kind of, there is some room to be flexible while still maintaining computational tractability.
Yeah. So, for example, one function that is a good function that space is if you start off exponential for low inputs, but then become linear for higher inputs, and that's sometimes it's just better behaved than a full exponential, and it's still you still end up with a convex fitting problem.
Great. Thanks, guys. That was very comprehensive. Okay, so we can move on to the next question then. So we've got a couple that are tied here. We've got another question from Yian actually about how to interpret temporal filter parameters and whether temporal filter parameters have some sort of structure. Does the structure have some sort of biological meaning or implementation where the brain could actually be doing this?
Yeah, I can jump in with the first thought on this. So we know that there are all kinds of time constants in the brain, right? Starting with just the time constants of ion channels opening and closing. And so when we use temporal filters to fit, say, spiking data, we're trying to take into account the fact that there are these time constants. So whether it's from, at the molecular level, whether it's because you have reverberations in a connected network, and so there's hysteresis and there's long correlation times that occur in those networks. So we can try to capture some of those features by using temporal filters when we're building, say, a GLM model of data. One of the fun things, I don't know if you guys touched on this today, but that you can do is you can actually have a model of, say, 2 spike trains, 2 neurons. And you can have a temporal filter for one of those neurons based on the spikes of the other one, and vice versa. And when you do that, then you can allow for the fact that we know that there's these influences, right? So you can think of it as sort of a fake synapse almost, or somehow we can capture these couplings in a real network by using these temporal filters. And so you can think about what are the timescales of those interactions, and we can capture them statistically with these parameters.
That sounds like something maybe you've done in your own work.
So we've at least, well, the multi-neuron case is not something we actually did in the tutorial, but we talked about it in the lecture. Just to emphasize what Sean said, that these coupling filters, and this is true both for the coupling filters across neurons as well as for these temporal feedback filters, they're often very good ways to get ideas about possible biological mechanisms that might cause these dynamics. But it's also important always to remember that in the end, this is a statistical model fit. So this doesn't unambiguously tell us what the underlying mechanism is. And as Sean said, for example, for these temporal dynamics,
And we're back. We'll just check.
All right.
Are we back, guys? Please say something in the chat if you can hear us, and we will continue on. And we have switched places, which is always what happens. All right. And we're back. Okay. Moving forward. So this does kind of feed nicely into the next question then, which is this idea that you can fit these models, and they're statistical models, and they do a great job of maybe explaining or predicting what's going to happen. But then the next question is, okay, well, what is actually the brain doing? Is this actually what the brain is actually implementing? And so the next question is, can you talk more about the GLM assumptions? Do the regressors, the independent variables, or the X matrix need to be independent from each other? What would be the best way to quantify? Oh, actually, there was one. Sorry, I'm gonna switch because I started reading and I realized I was gonna go to the other question first. So just kidding. Let's go to Yi Ming's question, which is about the brain. So this is, today we've learned GLM and its application in encoding and decoding. Problems. I'd like to know whether our neurons act in the same way. Is there any evidence that neurons are encoding or decoding information in some ways which is equivalent or similar to the GLM? So what do we think about this question? Is this actually what the brain is doing? It's a philosophical question.
I mean, I think Jakob's he touched on this in his response to the last question, which is that this is a statistical model, right?
Yep.
This is not ground truth. What we're doing with these models is trying to capture as much of the statistical structure in the data as the flexibility of our model will allow. And only after we've done that can we try to make some claims about what it says about the brain that ultimately had originally produced the data.
Yeah, I like that.
So you look at your parameters, and then you try to make an interpretation.
Cool. So we have a third panelist now with us. This is Rishi. I will allow you to introduce yourself, please, and let us know where you're coming from and how you want to contribute to this conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rishi. Sorry, for some reason, I got a Thursday invitation because I'm in California and it's the middle of the night. And so I was expecting this to be tomorrow, which is why I look a little bit all over the place. But
it's okay.
I'm a professor at UC Davis, so I'm new here about a year in. I'm split between math and neuroscience. And I do some work in theory, trying to build theories of distributed neural network. And then I do some more data analysis work. And I've been doing stuff looking for low-dimensional manifolds in neural data. And yeah, so I'm excited to sort of take your questions.
Great. Okay. Thanks. So can we do this next one? So can you talk more about GLM assumptions? Do the regressors, independent variables, or X need to be independent from each other? What would be the best way to quantify the relationship between independent variables and then feed it to the GLM? What do we think about this one?
Okay, I can take this. So, so one thing that we do not need in a GLM, so we do not need the covariates or the inputs to be independent. I mean, this is in fact one of the cool things about GLMs, that you can use it to characterize the neuron's response to different things that might be correlated with each other, okay? So they do not have to be independent. Having said that, if they're completely correlated, so that you'd have two inputs and they always come up together, then it will be very hard for the GLM to figure out whether the first input or the second input is the one that's a better predictor of spiking, because they always come up together. So they don't have to be independent, but if they're too correlated, then the fitting problem you can get can make it very hard to figure out which one of those two is statistically the best explanation. Yeah, so in that sense, they do not have to be independent.
Okay, great. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the next question then. So here's the next question. What are the advantages and disadvantages of L1 and L2 regularization, respectively? I used elastic net regression to perform regression, resulting in all theta values equal to 0. Did it mean that the dependent variable doesn't have any significant correlation with any predictors? If there are ways for me to improve the model, or is it definitive results?
I could say a little bit about L1 versus L2. I think, it's kind of, when you're regularizing something, you're trying to exclude certain kinds of structures. You're saying that, maybe I don't want some really big positive parameters and some really big negative parameters. that cancel out to fit something small. And so you're kind of working off this intuition that whatever model you're fitting, in some sense, the coefficients are meaningful in some way. Meaningful could mean either that they don't take huge values or that they're sparse, and so on. And so whenever you're thinking about regularization, I think it really helps to kind of sit down and ask yourself, what do I expect from my model? What are the natural physical constraints? L2 regularization is a very natural thing to do. It really penalizes big things. The other reason to really like L2 regularization, L2 structures are mathematically very well behaved. And so there are lots of efficient algorithms for them. People mostly use L1 regularization as a proxy for sparsity. And so by sparsity, I mean that a lot of your coefficients are 0. Now, it turns out that actually finding a sparse solution is a really, really hard problem. It's, NP hard. But L1 regularization is a good approximation to sparsity. And so whenever you think that your problem should have sparse structure, L1 regularization is a good proxy to use them. Elastic nets use both, and you have some flexibility to play around with how much you weight one versus how much you weight the other.
Great,
yeah,
thanks.
Thanks. Maybe just to add to the second part of the question, if you do an elastic net and all parameters, all filters come out 0, there's two possible reasons for that. Either your regularization parameter is too strong, and the other potential reason is that maybe your inputs actually are not predictive. Maybe having everything 0 is the best possible prediction because your inputs are not predictive. Either of those two scenarios is likely going to be true in your situation.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and do another one. Okay, so according to the tutorial, so this is now about the tutorial, so Jakob maybe we'll be able to do that for you. Using GLM, when most features don't affect the outcome, we can assume that the parameter vector is sparse, but it doesn't mean that non-zero coefficients indicates that only those features carry useful information. So when can we assume that some input features really are not important? I guess the way that I would assume this is that, or the way that I would start answering this one would be that it kind of depends on the definition of information that you're trying to model here. If the information is really just contained or specific to the one particular outcome variable that you care about, then you can say that these neurons do not maybe carry, or these units do not maybe carry like particular information about that particular thing. But that doesn't mean that those neurons or units or voxels or whatever are not actually doing anything. And so it means that maybe you just need to change your question a little bit. I know this is kind of a broad, high-level explanation or answer to the question, but maybe that'll get us started in answering this particular question.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure whether I'm answering the question correctly, but it also, part of the question seems to be that let's say you have two parameters that are non-zero, and does this mean that both of these inputs, let's say both of these upstream neurons are both synaptically connected to the neuron trying to predict? So does a non-zero parameter actually imply a causal influence of those inputs onto the neural firing? And even when the coefficients are non-zero, so even when they help predicting, it might be that the underlying causal structure is not aligned with that. So it could be that you have two inputs, and the first one is really truly predictive and causally causing the neuron to spike, and the second one is just strongly correlated with it. And then it can be hard for the GLM to figure out which one it should use, and it does non-zero parameters to both of them, although really the first one is the one that carries the prediction performance, and the other one is just tagging along with it. In the infinite data regime, if this is a perfectly observed model, then one of them should go to 0, but for finite data, even when everything is observed, they might get non-zero values. So there's always this extra level of caution that we have to apply to interpreting parameters, both for the ones that are non-zero and for the ones that are non-zero. And we always have to remember we have finite data, we have an imperfect model, and we have also underlying structure that we're not observing directly.
I just want to emphasize one thing you said. So the point of using an L1 prior to try to force parameters to zero is exactly to deal with this problem, right? As you said, if you had an infinite amount of data, you should be able to figure out which one is the causal one and which one is just the correlate. But unfortunately, that's not what the real world gives us, and so we are left with the ambiguity. But that's actually the goal of using L1 regularization.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Thanks. So let's keep going. We're just whipping through these. I like this. Okay, so let's do the top rated one then, if that's okay. Another question from Yan. In the outro, you said that the GLM is good because it gives a unique solution and we can obtain it very quickly. However, as to L1 regularization, we don't have a closed form solution. This means it's not unique and quick anymore. Does this mean that L1 is not a good norm or a good way to do it for GLM? Good, not suitable for GLM. I don't know that I can answer the question.
I can jump in. It's not the case. Just because you don't have a closed form solution doesn't mean that the solution is not unique, right? With an L1 regularization, you can still have a convex optimization problem with a single solution. It's just it has increased computational burden compared to the simple, more mathematically well-behaved L2 case. So it's important that we don't conflate these two ideas. The L1 is totally suitable for the GLM if the goal is to try to figure out which of your inputs are the ones that actually are affecting the output, right? If you want to impose sparsity. So yeah, I think I hope that I got that right, but I think that's the important point here.
And when we say easy, we don't mean necessarily there's a closed solution. We just mean there's a good algorithm for finding the solution. And convex fitting problems from an optimization perspective are easy, although that doesn't correspond to the notion of easy we have as undergraduates working out things analytically. In fact, convex optimization problems are often easier to solve than complicated analytical forms when it comes to evaluating them computationally.
That's an interesting idea. So just because we can write a nice expression in our homework assignment or in our paper, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's better than using some algorithm to get the answer.
Depends on what your goal is, right? If your goal, because we started the whole school with goals of the models. And if your goal is to get to an answer that gives you good predictive power and that fits behavior or that fits the system that you're looking at, then this is potentially a great way to do it, even if you don't have an elegant, beautiful closed form solution. If what you care about is beauty and closed form solutions and simplicity in that respect, then this maybe isn't the right way to go about it. And so again, it's all about like what you care about, what you're trying to use the model to get at.
I'm sure there are good examples where you can get a closed form solution and you use that for analytical insight to understand the system. But actually, when you do the computation, you would do it in a different way. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are many examples like that.
So some eigenvalue problems fall into that, where if you can very quickly find the eigenvalues computationally, and like the expression that would go along with it is actually numerically not something you want to implement. Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense.
All right. So I think I'm going to skip around here because the upvotes are not making them in order for me. So I'm going to go to a question from Rebecca, which is, I want to know more about why we have a nonlinear part in the GLM. What's the point? Why do we do the nonlinearity? Plus, I believe there must be combinations between the nonlinear and the linear and nonlinear parts. So how do we choose? And I assume that what you mean, Rebecca, between how do we choose is how do we choose which ones to put together, and how do we choose whether to use a nonlinearity at all? So this is actually a really good question. So again, I'm going to let you guys take it away. But this is the type of question that we like here at Neuromatch Academy, because it's about not just you have this fancy tool and you plug it in and it gives you an answer and then you publish a paper. It's about which is the best tool for the job and how do you select that one, and what are the things to consider as you're selecting your tool. So good question. Great question. So how do we choose?
So I can give you some thoughts. So like, I think it's kind of interesting to think about what kinds of structures a linear model can capture and what structures it can't. And it turns out that there are a large number of pretty natural structures that you actually do terribly wrong if you try and fit in a linear model. And so, I think tomorrow you'll probably talk about PCA and dimensionality reduction. And it turns out that anytime you have sparse structure in your data, a linear model will just do terribly. It'll really, really overestimate the structure in your data. It'll tell you that there's much more, there's much more variability than there actually is. And so then you say, okay, well, what nonlinearity do I need? And there's sort of two ways to answer that question. One way to answer that question is kind of mechanistic. You say, let me take what I know about my system. I know that neurons get some input that comes in, they integrate this information, maybe it hits a threshold and then it spikes. And so can I build a linear nonlinear model that captures that, use linearity as much as possible, but put the nonlinear parts in where I think they're important. And for neurons, that's the threshold. So you want to capture something like that transition from rates to spikes. A second way you might try and combine linearity and nonlinearity is more mathematical or statistical. You might say, what kinds of models can I do good inference on? What kinds of models can I solve easily? And so GLMs, for example, pull from this set of ideas and statistics about exponential family models. And those models combine linear and nonlinear structure in a particular way that both gives you a lot of flexibility and allows for easy inference. And so, we like linear. We want to use linear as much as possible because it's easy. But sometimes we need nonlinear. Where do you put the nonlinear? One set of intuitions or insights comes from these mechanistic models. What do you know about your system? If you're good Bayesians, you try and use what you know about your system. And another set of insights comes about because, you're lazy, you want to be able to find a model that you can actually solve and get on with your life. And so some of it comes from mathematical tractability. But, I think it's an interesting and deep question.
I think there's a related point is it also comes from the data, right? So depending on the kind of data that you collect, then that sort of puts you in different categories of the kinds of models that you might want to use. Now, of course, you can force data into kind of any bucket you want to force it into. So for example, if you have spikes, you might think it's natural to use a nonlinear model that has positive rates, right? So something like a Poisson GLM. But you could, of course, bin your spikes and count them up and get a number and then use a linear model. And so there's another question, which is how much do you want to take the data in its natural state and try to build a model to match that versus try to massage it into a way that fits into some other simpler system that you might feel more comfortable using those tools.
Yeah. So, I mean, both this question and the one we had kind of quite early on in the Q&A, they come back to these general issues on how do you build models, right? And this is something that that other parts of neuroimaging are also dealing with. What we told you about is about some mathematical tools you can use to predict spiking or decisions, but much of the work is actually selecting from this toolkit of many possible models you could build, the model you actually want to build. And there's often an iterative process where you start off with a model that you think this is some good compromise between tractability and what I think is right about the system. Then you apply this to data and you figure out something goes wrong or seems unplausible, and then you refine your model. But there's a lot of hard work and thought going into building a model that's both appropriate for the question at hand and that's also tractable computationally. And this is much of the hard work that on an example where you don't know what the right answer is, can take a lot of time to figure out what is the right the model to build. And that's the art and science in statistical model building that is still left for you to do on your data.
Definitely. These are great questions, guys. Keep them coming. Okay, so let's see. We've got one at the top here from Cecilia, which is when different stimulus sources are presented simultaneously, is it possible to use a GLM to get temporal filters in other fields, which is called transformation, I guess, to those different sources from the same recorded signals, one recorded signal, but over two stimuli? Let me see if I can parse this. Let me think about this for a second. Temporal filters with other fields, which is called transformation, I guess. Okay.
So, I mean, I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question correctly, but some of that seems to be, can you use these temporal filters also in scenarios where you have multiple inputs presented simultaneously? And the answer is yes. So you can take as your input, let's say you have two stimuli, and then you can say my inputs are the stimuli now, the stimuli on the previous frame, and the stimuli on 2 or 3 frames ago, right? You can just say, I make myself a transformed, expanded stimulus that consists of just stacking together the stimuli I had in the recent past and using that as one bigger set of regressors. And so whenever things are observed, you can stack them together into stimulus, into covariates. You can also nonlinear transform them. So you can say, I take the stimulus and the square stimulus and the cubic of the stimulus, and I make myself kind of a big covariate input and just throw my GLM on it. So you can always do this. At some point, you might obviously run into computation problems or into overfitting problems, but conceptually, you can always transform your inputs in such a way to kind of build a more powerful predictor.
Great, thanks. Anybody have anything they want to add to that?
Well, there's this comment that Young Cheng asked, which is like in the cocktail party problem. And I think that the way to think about this here is, let's say you have just one covariate, call it X, but you also have reason to think that X is at every time point is, you only measure X, but at every time point you think it's a sum of, S1 and S2. And can you figure out what those different components are? And there are ways to do that. It's not, you would have to add additional machinery on top of the GLM, some sort of source separation, maybe a matrix factorization kind of problem on the data. So I think that that's an additional complexity that you'd have to build into your model to try to get to that sort of solution. But it is possible in this framework.
Great. Okay. Thanks. So we've got time for a few more here. Keep them coming, guys. But we can also take questions that are bigger and broader, that are, these are very nitty-gritty, like kind of detailed questions, which is fantastic. And I'm so glad that you guys are asking these. But we can also think about how to fit GLMs into a kind of a broader framework as well. So don't be afraid to ask kind of broad questions as well as detailed ones. Okay, well, here's actually a broader kind of detailed one, a broader one that kind of applies outside of GLM. So this is great. So Rebecca is asking, sometimes, especially with behavioral paradigms, we cannot get enough data for both test and validation. How do we balance the validation data and the test data? So this is a much bigger question than just GLMs, but this is great. So let's talk about this one. And so Hanbo is given a comment here that says, leave one out is an effective way with a small data set. So this is about, are you splitting your data into training and test, or do you have training and cross-validation and then a test set, or those kinds of questions? So we can talk about this a little bit maybe, which is good because this applies not just to GLM day, but to kind of any model fitting. So I'm glad that we're talking about this. So if any of you guys want to jump in on this one, I'm happy to let you take the reins here.
Yeah, I mean, I can provide an answer. I wish there was a better answer than the one I'm going to give you, but it's very hard to come up with a principled way to choose the balance between your training, test, and validation set. One thing that's often done is that typically you have like something like 80% of your data in the training set, 10% and 10% each in the test and validation set. So like a split where most of your data is in the training set. For most models, you will need that. And this often is a challenge, as you say, in particular when you have small data sets. One thing that's really important, though, and I want to emphasize, is one thing you should not be doing is to play around too much with that split. You can't try out all possible ways to split it like 80%, 90%, 95%, leave one out. If you try out many of those splits, then what's really happening is that the choice of how you split this is becoming like a hidden fudge parameter of your model or of your analysis, and you do this too much. You allow yourself to have extra flexibility, and that might give you optimistic estimates on how well this regression is going. So whatever split you should do, I mean, pick a reasonable split and then stick with it and don't play around with it too much. Otherwise, you might be fooling yourself into thinking that you can predict better than you actually can.
And if you do that too much, then the next time you do it to a different data set with the thing that you optimized for this data set, you're going to have the same problem over again. And so it just kind of takes the problem to the next data set instead of staying within your own, the current data set.
Yeah, there's this idea, it's called the garden of forking paths in analysis, that the more free choices you can make, the more hidden control you have over what you come out. And that's always a dangerous garden to go into when you want to have reliable results.
Actually, I'm curious. This is not something that I'm an expert in at all. I'm curious, when you have, say, simpler models, like something that you can that's convex, so you feel like you have computational tractability. Does it make sense to do something like leave one out and just try all possible, train all possible training sets and see if you can get better insight by doing that rather than just doing a single split?
There's a long answer, which I'm not sure we should discuss here, but there's a trade-off also when you do leave one out optimization. Then you have a gigantic overlap in your test sets, which affects the independence of the estimates you get. So doing leave one out is not necessarily kind of much better than taking a bigger data set, having a bigger training set.
So the short answer is you have to try some things, but don't try too many things. Right? Come up with a principled reason why you're making the split the way you are based on the size of the data set that you have. Unsatisfying answer, perhaps, but what we're trying to do here is build a little bit of intuition about what the options are, so and how to do that in different types of data sets. Okay. So we've got just a couple more minutes here, and we've got a few more questions that are all kind of tied with a few right up at the top. So maybe we can do these right up at the top. Rebecca is asking, under what kind of circumstances can we use the GLM model? To be specific, what should we need to consider when choosing the GLM model apart from the features of the input and the output variables, that is the underlying pattern? I think maybe this is like in respect to choosing a different kind of model that you might use that's not a GLM, maybe like some other kind of deep learning model, perhaps. I'm not sure exactly. So Rebecca, I'm going to take a best guess here at what you mean. But maybe if there are other models that you could have chosen, how do you select that the GLM is the best one? I think the answer for me would come down to the goals also first. So I know I'm leaning heavily on that, but that's kind of the big picture that we want to put everything in is, what are you trying to explain? What level of explanation are you trying to get at? And also, what data do you have? So you've got, the features of the input and output variables, but given that GLM can be used for both encoding and decoding models, but you have a lot of other choices also for how you can have explanation build up to connect all of the variables in your system. It's really just about what you're trying to do with it. I know that's also one of those unsatisfying answers. It's like, it really depends, but it really does, unfortunately.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, and GLMs or linear models are very simple. So when you don't know what to do, a GLM is always a good model to start with, although depending on the goals and the data, you might end up using a more complicated model later. But you should always try out the simplest reasonable model before you jump to something more complicated. You want to learn much more complicated techniques later in the summer school. So GLM relative to those is actually a very simple thing to try out. So if you're not sure yet, this is a good thing to start with.
And it comes nicely in some packages as well, right? So you don't have to build it from scratch. It is a nice thing to start with to try to understand even something as simple as, do I have enough data to be able to build a model to begin with? Do I have enough data to be able to pull the signal from the noise? This is often a great way to start, to say, I've got these data. I'm going to type into, scikit-learn. I'm going to use this logistic regression model. I'm going to use this kind of standard approach because it's easy. You don't have to build it from scratch like you did in the tutorials today. You can use the packages that are built into your favorite software package, and you can try it out. So it's a good way to start.
And they're good building blocks.
The easy models are also easy to program, so you don't get as much benefit from using the packages.
That's true. And by learning how to build it from scratch today, you understand it a lot better than just typing like model.train. Like that's all you get, right? You need to understand really what it's doing underneath. Rishi, sorry, you were saying something?
I was just going to say that they're also nice building blocks. Like you can think about a deep network as a bunch of GLMs sitting on top of each other. And if you understand what a GLM's doing, then you can say, well, what are 2 GLMs doing and what are 10 GLMs doing? And you kind of build up intuition that way.
All right, great. So let's maybe do one last one here from me, Ian, which is, why is a linear model more interpretable? And so the simple answer here would be, our puny human brains have trouble processing and running models that are nonlinear in our heads. That's the simple answer, is that it's hard for us to think about these. So if you do care about interpretation, you have to look at the limits of human interpretation capacity. I don't know if anybody has a better thing to answer in this way.
Another thing to notice is that a linear model basically does the same thing at every point in your stimulus space. A nonlinear model, nonlinearity basically says that what you're doing changes depending on where you are. So if you think about the way x goes, the line, it looks the same everywhere. If you look at x squared or x cubed, or something more complicated, it starts to get sharper as it goes on. With the linear model, you can just tell a simple story that applies everywhere. Take this input, multiply it by 3, take that input, multiply it by 5. For a nonlinear model, you might say, oh, if this input is small, we're multiplying it by 3, but if it's big, we're multiplying it by 10. But then what about if this other input is small? Things can combine in more complicated ways. A linear model is multiplying.
That's interesting. We were talking about this, I think maybe before you joined, Rishi, about that in some cases you might not want to use the canonical link function because it's better for your understanding and interpretability. So, for example, Jakob mentioned that you might want to use a function that's exponential when it's small and then linear when it's larger, and that also has this nice property that in that larger regime we know that for all points of x it's doing the same thing, and so that's sort of that additional interpretability. So it has these kinds of additional convenience.
Cool. All right. Well, guys, it is 12:01. So I think that is probably a good place for us to stop. We've got some other questions, though, that we did not get to. So as always, please take these to the discussion forums. This is a great way to continue the conversation. and to get some of these detailed questions answered. And also, just because we didn't get to it today doesn't mean it's not an important question or a good question. And so please do take them to the discussion forums and keep the conversation going there. So thanks very much to our panelists for joining me this evening. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your night. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Megan.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.